had the beatniks, the 1950s. We had the hippies, 1960s. The gay and lesbian community, the 1970s and 80s. Today we're having people coming from all over the world with their new ideas and entrepreneurial spirit, looking for their fortunes. We have all the high-tech kids coming in, so it really is kind of bookending where we've been for 200 whatever years. But I digress. Let's talk a little bit about the people that arrived in San Francisco. When they arrived, there were 2 schools, there were 2 churches, there were 500 bars, there were 1,000 gambling establishments, there were 3 houses that were being built every day, 1 murder every single day, 90% of the population were men, 10% of the population were entrepreneurial women, if you know what I mean. But eventually the city settled down and became the largest city on the West Coast for many years. But let's talk about the people that came up here to the hills. When they first arrived, the native people up here went, "Oh, look, new people, come, share the bounty of our land." And after a couple of months, they went, "Boy, there's a hell of a lot of you up here sharing the bounty of our land." And after about 5 years, they went, "You know what, go home, there's too many of you." It was too late. There's a lot of tension between the settlers and the native people. There's one settler in particular, his name was John Savage. He didn't like the Indians very much. He was looking for an excuse to get rid of them off the land. He was a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and he would provoke the Indians and piss them off and piss them off. And one day, they got so angry they burned down his trading post. Well, that's all that John Savage needed. He went to all of his friends who were also veterans of the Mexican-American War, and he created the Mariposa Battalion. Now, the Mariposa Battalion had one job and one job only, and that was to get rid of all of the native peoples off the land here. They would chase them. Whenever they would capture an Indian, they would hear the word Yosemite. Now, they had no idea what Yosemite meant, but they chased him, they chased him, they chased him. Yosemite. Well, eventually they chased him into this incredible granite valley, and they went, "Oh, this must be Yosemite." So they named it Yosemite Valley. The irony here is Yosemite means invaders, bad guys, horrible people. So the locals, the settlers, decided to name it after themselves. The invaders, the horrible people, the bad guys. Well, within a couple of years, they pretty much got rid of all the gold out of the hills here. And the people that spent their family fortunes to get up here didn't have enough money to get home. So many became sheep herders, some became farmers, some became timber people. But the smart ones went, "You know, we got this Yosemite Valley and we got this incredible growing city of San Francisco. Why don't we start the tourism industry and start bringing people up to check out Yosemite?" So they went to Washington, D.C., and they had President Lincoln, this is 1864, they were able to convince him to turn Yosemite into a nature reserve. It wasn't a national park. The national parks did not exist in 1864. So the only thing that Lincoln did as president that did not involve the Civil War was signing the Yosemite land grant, which gave Yosemite over to the state of California to administer as a nature reserve. Several years later, they created the national parks. The first one was Yellowstone. The second one was Yosemite. That was in the 1880s. Around about that time, there was a very weird guy. He was a hippie, but he was 100 years before his time. Just like the hippies, he had long hair, barefoot, college dropout, Jesus freak. 100 years before his time. His name was John Muir. John Muir dropped out of the University of Wisconsin, went home to Kentucky, and said to his father, "I want to go to Argentina." His father said, "Why Argentina?" He said, "I don't know, but let's go to Argentina." His father said, "I'm not going to support you in that." So John Muir decided to walk to Florida to get on a boat. So he walked about 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers to Florida, got on a boat, headed for Argentina, but he weakened his body so badly that on the boat he got malaria, and they wouldn't let him off the boat in Argentina. So he continued around the Horn, and he ended up in San Francisco. If he come 100 years later, he would have been in paradise. He would have been a hippie. But this is the 1860s, and he went, no, too much for me. So he decided to walk east check out this Yosemite thing. And as he's walking through the valleys here, he's looking at all the trees being cut down by the timber industry and all the fields being eaten by the sheep, called sheep, the rats of the hills. He decided to create an organization called the Sierra Club. And the Sierra Club had one job, and that was to preserve all these mountains up here for future generations. They would, for all the Sierra Mountains would be conserved. And as president of the Sierra Club, he was president for 30 years. He lived in Yosemite for 7 years. The rest of the time, he'd come back and forth to Yosemite. One day, he decided to have a presidential summit. He invited President Roosevelt. We're talking 1903 at this point. This is Teddy Roosevelt, 1903. He invited him to come and have a presidential summit. The very, very first presidential summit was just two men riding around on horseback talking about the future of the park. No media, no handlers, just two men camping out in Yosemite. And Muir was so influential that he was able to convince Roosevelt to go back to Washington, D.C. and have them extend the boundaries of Yosemite National Park to include not only the valley, but all the lands around the valley, that include all the mouths of all the rivers, so they couldn't pollute any of the lands upriver from the valley. And so today Yosemite is about the size of the state of Rhode Island. Most of you are not Americans. Rhode Island is one of the 50 states. So we've got a park the size of one of our states.